Okay.
So for the first part, how it's different between classes. Well, obviously, rich people have it easier in jail. There's also different jails for rich people because there's like jails that are like pay to stay, like a hotel where you like pay to stay there, and it's kind of like living in a hotel.
Yeah.
Also,
Also the concept of bail and like that is like obviously more beneficial to wealthier people who can pay off the bill. So it's like for them, crimes that just require bail are basically like just
it doesn't matter. Yeah, they can be out because sometimes it takes months, if not years, for a trial to happen, and people who can't afford bail are stuck in jail for those months to years. Where if you're rich enough to afford bail, you can be out like in your house, like on house arrest during that time.
Yeah.
Well, they're like whenever they have to like serve their time, it's usually like not even a year, and they're like usually out in like a month or two.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mostly like the clear target in the criminal justice system is most often young Black men.
Right.
And they're more likely, I mean, this starts to go into like before getting to jail and like how, you know, how they get there, and they're more likely to be stopped by police than a white person, which is often like includes violent interactions.
It talks about that on page
Yeah, and like police.
4. It mentions what Mikalie was saying.
Yeah.
That a young Black male wearing baggy pants standing in front of his high school surrounded by a group of similarly dressed Black friends may be stopped and searched because police believes he looks like a drug dealer.
Yeah, and it says in like one of our readings, I think it's the one's American Policing Under Fire. It talks about how like disadvantaged communities and like poor neighborhoods are generally monitored by police more.
Yeah, for sure.
And obviously those are generally historically filled with people of color because of like segregation and stuff. And also like the reason they're monitored is like a lot of the residents of those neighborhoods, like it says on page 271, residents of these neighborhoods engage in unconventional survival practices, which includes like selling drugs because they don't really have any other options.
Right.
So it's kind of like unfair in that way.
And I think something that I just found out while we were reading, it says, well, so basically police are allowed to use racial bias when stopping someone. And I think it was page 264, and it was like the dirty little secret of policing that the Supreme Court has granted the police license to discriminate. And so, I mean, it can't be their only reason for stopping someone, but it can be part of the reason that they stop someone. And so I think that has a huge impact on the amount of people, race and gender, you know, Black men that are being put into the criminal justice system. And it says in one of the readings by Rory Kramer, Black youth are 41% more likely to be victims of any police use of force rather than a white youth. So
yeah, like going off of what you said on that, I think that same reading on page 265, it says that as long as officers refrain from uttering racial epithets, and they don't actually like explicitly say that race was the reason, like they can use other like like you were saying earlier about like a Black man wearing baggy pants, like they can use other factors that are obviously based in like racial stereotypes, but not like completely like it's not specified, then they can get away with that.
Yeah. And then when Black people obviously are more likely to get arrested, and like I said, when they do go to jail, their prison experience is usually a lot worse. I remember in my Crim 101 class freshman year, the professors in the like School of Criminology, they're not professors, they're just like people who work in criminology, and he was a detective who apparently worked the Ted Bundy case, but he said that like he's been in jails all over the country, and where people go for white collar crime, like where rich white men, businessmen go, they have golf courses and stuff at their prisons.
Yeah.
So there's also like the big difference how it's like stratified by class. It's like, you know, you see like the jails you've seen like documentaries that are like terrible and gross and stuff, and then there's separate prisons for rich white people where they have golf courses and like TVs in every like cell, but their cells are like bedrooms.
Yeah.
I think it not necessarily, I don't think it, I think also gender is a big thing. I'm a crim major, so I've taken like several crim courses being here, and I took a field trip to the York Women's Prison last semester, and their facilities are way different than like what NSP is, like Nebraska State Penitentiary. Just because, I mean, I don't want to be the one to say it, but like women do have different needs than, men might. Like they need medications, and if they're,
They need certain sanitary products.
yeah, or like if they just had like a baby, they have like a motherhood program where they're able to be with their baby, so they have the resources for that. And it's not even just with race, because there were women of color in there too that had the same amount of things that the white people had in that prison. So I think too, gender is also a factor.
Yeah, I would say that like when it comes, if you combine like race and gender, obviously like Black men are the most likely to be targeted by police because they're seen as like aggressive and hostile. And like you've heard it all like in all of these like recent shootings that have been happening over the years, like every time the officer says like they felt like their life was in danger because of these like stereotypes that are ingrained in their minds.
Yeah, I found some statistics about both race and gender, and so just men and women in general, 1 in 9 men will be imprisoned at some point in their lifetime, and 1 in 56 women will be imprisoned at some point in their lifetime. And then white men, it's 1 in 17. Black men, it's 1 in 3. Latino men, it's 1 in 6. And then white women is 1 in 111. Black women is 1 in 18. And Latino women is 1 in 45. So obviously, like, those are huge differences between both the men and women for about all the races, but as well as like obviously the proportions.
Yeah, and a lot of these like arrests are for like usually for like drug possession, which, and like I think same in like the same reading, the new Jim Crow, it says that like mostly drug use is pretty much equal or at the same rate across races. So then you can obviously see this bias in the statistics of how many people are getting arrested, like you just listed them off.
Yeah. And then I even in one of I think it was Roy Kramer again said in his article that I think it was either Black girls or Black women were predicted they were stopped about the same as like white boys, and he was talking about how it was kind of like Black women versus Black men and then white men, and it said like Black women were stopped just as much as white like boys were, or like younger boys. And so it still shows that like even though there are gender differences, like because males are often to get stopped more than women, but like Black women were still stopped just as much as young white males.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's like the statistics that I just read off is pretty much exactly that. It's 1 in 17 white men and 1 in 18 Black women will be in prison. So it's about the exact same, even though you'd think that men are arrested at higher rates and imprisoned at higher rates, which they are. So it's surprising that those two statistics are dang near even.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And something else that I found really interesting is he says that when he talked a lot about like force and police using force when they stop people, and it actually said that gender influences whether force is used with adults, but did not affect whether police draw or aim guns at children. And so I thought that it was really interesting that gender like didn't have an effect on whether they're pulling a gun. I don't know.
That's actually really surprising.
Yeah.
I think it'd be men would be the brunt of that more than women, because men are just seen more as like aggressors, and obviously physically they're normally stronger, so like it would be realistic to be more worried about a man than a woman if you're arresting someone.
Yeah, and I feel like if like what you were saying, it's the statistic of like Black women being stopped as much as like white men are. I bet it's same with like if they use force or not.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's probably less than Black men, but still more than white women.
And I think like most of the time men are kind of hesitant with using force with women just because it is such a like, I mean, like, isn't, is it a law that like you aren't supposed to hit a woman? Is that a thing?
It's just like
It's not like
ingrained in
a
our
law. It's just kind
Yeah.
of like a social norm.
Yeah, and so I think that probably has to do on a little bit of the gender influence on whether the force is used, and whether, I don't know, it'd be interesting to look at whether force is used with adults versus younger kids and children.
Yeah, and I also thought another interesting point that was made in the same reading, the new Jim Crow one, was how like they talk about how courts use like this new like sort of idea that we are live in a colorblind society to like show that like, oh, race isn't really a factor in like what police do to people. And I thought that tied into like one of our earlier readings in like white fragility, where it talks about like a lot of like, I think it says somewhere like 60% of white people think that like the use of police force is usually done on a fair basis. But I think that's because like if you tie it into the white fragility reading, it's like most of the times white people can't see themselves from a racialized standpoint because they don't have to live it like that way.
Yeah,
Do we want to move on to the next question?
probably. We are 12 minutes in just for time.
There we go.
Oh,
Hey.
no, it has unlimited.
Perfect. So the second question is, there's 3 questions in this. So do we want to go through each one separately or just the whole thing?
I would just read the whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Why is there a heavy emphasis on policing drug crimes versus other crimes? What effects does that have on communities? And then what are the racial undertones of the war on drugs versus the opioid epidemic?
I feel like there's heavy emphasis on like policing drug crimes just because drug addiction is a really big thing, like without in the world. And I don't know, just like a lot of crimes probably do come from like drugs being involved.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I also feel like drug crimes are easier to find because again, like they look in marginalized communities where these things like people like partake in drugs often because like they don't have any other options. Like this is how they make money, or they turn to drugs because like there's always like a feeling of hopelessness when you live in a poorer area. So sometimes they use drugs to escape. So it's just easier to go and arrest marginalized people if you criminalize drugs.
Yeah. And I mean, the war on drugs, I feel like we all learned this growing up, is like, Richard Nixon's war on drugs was always kind of like low-key a race thing. Like they would send them to low-income, marginalized communities to just like stop and frisk when that was beginning to be legalized. So they could just stop and frisk anyone for no reason. They weren't doing that in affluent white cities and like communities. They were doing that in poorer communities. I also found something interesting when I was reading about the war on drugs, that Richard Nixon's domestic policy chief in 1994 suggested that the war on drugs had ulterior motives and like actually like getting drugs off the street, and it was literally just to help Nixon keep his job because obviously like he was under scrutiny with his presidency.
Yeah, it's like a way to make it seem like he's doing something.
Yeah, I feel like he was trying to appeal to like, Richard Nixon was a Republican, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like he was just trying to appeal to like that kind of party and those kind of people, especially like affluent white people. Those are your donors who give you money for campaigns and whatnot. And I feel like that was kind of being pushed on him, and then it ended up affecting so many poor people just because he wanted to keep his job.
Well, I feel like with drugs, like the policing goes into like really like those rundown like poor communities, because like everyone just assumes like, oh, it's the poor communities and everything, they're gonna have all like the drug lords and all the like high crime for drugs and everything, when like in the book like page 162 it says like there's the notion that whites compromise the vast majority of drug users and dealers and may well be more likely than other racial groups to commit drug crimes.
Yeah.
So I found that fascinating.
Yeah, and I think it says like drug trafficking occurs everywhere in America, not just in poor neighborhoods.
Right.
Yeah, it's on page 261. It says people of all races use and sell illegal drugs at a remarkably similar rate, but it's just like, again, it's racial profiling, and you know, people think in these poor communities that there's more going on, and that so then they focus usually on like these smaller crimes, where then when we kind of move into the opioid epidemic, a lot of those have to do with like white people that have more money and can afford these, like, you know, kind of bigger drugs almost. Like I feel like a lot of the smaller crimes are like marijuana, like small amounts, but like the opioid epidemic. And it even talked about in one of the readings that the framing of the opiate epidemic as white and middle class, and the assumption that all white drug users, you know, like these are the primary figures of the people that are being affected by the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, I think that pretty much answers that last question. I feel like the racial undertones, like the war on drugs is like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and you're looking at low-income communities, and then opioid epidemic is obviously because they're like narcotics, and normally you get addicted to them after you get injured and you're in the hospital and get prescribed them. That's more looked at more as like a rich white person drug. And I feel like
when people talk about the opioid epidemic, they don't talk about it like, oh, like he was like a thug on the street and this was his life. They're like, oh, it was like my precious daughter and like now her life is ruined.
Yeah, like she got addicted after her surgery. Like,
and like this is what like living in high class society does. It's the pressure, like the way it's viewed by like the media is vastly different.
They make it seem like it's not like their fault that they have that addiction.
Exactly.
Well, that's true because that's true because there's been a lot of blame on hospitals and doctors for prescribing opioids to kids after surgeries and injuries and stuff. Like, I don't know if you've seen that, but like that's normally like where like people's anger goes to, is like not them for using it, it's that doctor for prescribing it. Like he should have just taken ibuprofen.
Versus like with the war on drugs, I think it talks about like in the new Jim Crow reading where it's like it's assumed that everybody gets their drugs from like the ghetto, but like usually people sell to their own race. Like white people usually buy from white people and black people usually buy from black people, and that can happen in any neighborhood. But with like the opioid epidemic, they look for external factors or like places where they get the drugs.
Do we want to move on to our last final question?
Yeah.
Before we do that, I just had two interesting statistics on drugs in general, which is African Americans make up 62% of drug offenders, yet they're only 12% of the U.S. population, and Black men are sent to federal prison for drug crimes at a rate 57 times higher than white men. So I think that right there shows you how there is obviously a clear discrepancy, and there's no way around arguing that. Yeah.
I found some like similar statistics to that it was in one of the readings on page 261 that African Americans constitute 80% to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison, but then 90% of those admitted to prison were Black or Latino. So it just like shows the massive amounts of colored people that were being incarcerated.
Not like a 20 to a 57%, like where Mikalie was reading just a sentence after that. At least 15 states, Blacks are admitted to prison on drug charges at a rate from 20 to 57 times greater than that of white men. So.
Does anyone else hear that?
Yeah.
I'm not crazy.
Okay. We have the last question now?
Yes.
Yeah. How are we doing on time?
We're just at 20 minutes, so we have plenty of time.
Okay.
I also have multiple questions in it, so
Audra, your microphone's kind of like freaking out.
Moving out, yeah, I'm not surprised.
Okay. Do we want to do it question by question or just like the entire thing? I guess.
Let's just do the entire thing like we did with the one before.
Okay. What are the after effects of mass incarceration? What happens to the people after their time served? Is the emphasis on punishment or rehabilitation, and why? What kind of policing reforms do the readings suggest, but also what changes do you think would be most beneficial to communities?
I feel like we should talk about the first three before we get into that last part for sure, though.
Okay.
The first three I'll tie together.
And for me, like, I found that,
Like after mass like incarceration, a lot of people they like just lose their jobs. They're not able to pay like their bills or anything, and so they fall behind. And they get evicted from their houses.
Yeah,
And
I
then-
guess.
Yeah.
So I guess the big thing, like is it emphasis on punishment or rehabilitation? I think it's definitely on punishment, and I found some statistics on recidivism rates, which means like the odds of them going back to prison after going to prison in one time. It's about 76% after within like the first 5 years, and within the first year alone, it's a 44% recidivism rate. So I feel like obviously it can't be emphasis on rehabilitation. Otherwise, why would those numbers be so ridiculously high? Like you're more likely, like
because they're not like getting assistance, whether it could be like help with a drug addiction or like if they were to do some sort of like work release or probation, where they're being required to check in with a person, that kind of keeps them in line a little bit. You know.
And I think it's really hard for people coming out of jail because, I mean, they talked about like a whole study that they did. But it's like these people are like, they really struggle to find jobs. So then it's like they don't have a good paying job. They don't have money to support themselves. They don't like, because, I mean, they can't get a job because it says that they've been to jail. And so then these employers don't even consider but they find it very hard to move forward, and so then it's like they kind of go back to their own ways, whereas there isn't things in place to help them move forward. And even it talked about in one of the readings that their meetings with their probation officers were hours away, where they if they did have a job, they would have to miss a day, and you can't miss a day every week. So yeah, I think I think it definitely focuses on punishment rather than rehabilitation because there's nothing to help them.
Yeah, and with like the employment after effect too, it's like when we talk about like in some of our other readings where it's like Black people already get hired way less than white people,
Right.
like without a criminal record. So once you add a criminal record to that, it makes it almost impossible for them to get a job, because I think somewhere in the reading it says only 14% of Black men without a criminal record get called back, even though usually like white men who have a criminal record are 50% still likely to get called back. So even without the record, they already get called back so much less.
And I think that ties into like the big argument you hear all the time is like not like getting rid of having to put down that you're a felon when you apply for a job, because it's like if you served your time, like why are you still feeling those after effects when you get out? Like if the point of jail is the punishment for you did this crime, you're serving X amount of time, like that's your like due to society. It's like why are you still putting them at a disadvantage when they come out and like it's following around for the rest of their lives, which is a big argument.
I found like
It was like on page 278 that even like though employers like they're not allowed to discriminate against people that have criminal backgrounds, they literally 3/4 of the employees would literally ask the people applying like what they did and like wanted details and everything.
Yeah, and I would say that like usually like Black applicants probably get asked a lot more than white applicants would.
And I think, I mean, this kind of goes back to the whole like war on drugs versus opioid epidemic. I think when they were talking about the opioid epidemic, they definitely talk a lot more about rehabilitation with those people, and so I think that's again a race difference. Is a lot of times it's like, oh, these poor white kids that are
Yeah,
getting
like these rich
themselves,
kids.
yeah, and so it's like, oh, let's focus on getting them help and putting them into rehab, where it's like, you know, people who live in lower income communities don't have the money to, you know, get them to rehab or, you know, all this stuff.
Yeah,
It's I feel like
because
the
rehab does cost like $5,000 for like a 3-month program usually.
and so I think these white like people who are going through and, you know, after even in the job market, there a lot of employers are like, oh, they're gonna try to start over and build themselves up and start something new, you know, they kind of like want to help them, whereas they see Black people as, oh, they're just gonna keep, you know, continuing in this crime
Yeah,
circle.
it's
So
more about like keeping them off the streets in
Mhm.
general versus like with the opioid epidemic, it's like, okay, like you can be rehabilitated from this and become like a better person after this.
Yeah, and tying in the after effects of being incarcerated with drugs, it's like, I don't know, if you have a Twitter, you probably see if at least like a few times a month the like argument that now that marijuana is being legalized in many states, why are people still serving jail time for marijuana charges if it's a legal substance now? And then
Yeah,
even the people who've gotten out of jail on their marijuana charges, that's still on your record for the rest of your life. And it's like, well, if you can go into a dispensary in Colorado if you're 21 and go buy it, why is this person who had maybe a few grams on them and got arrested and served a month and had to pay fines, and now it's on their record for the rest of the time? Like, how does that make sense?
And especially
yeah,
one of the arguments I've seen is like, especially right now when these dispensaries are open during a pandemic because they're considered essential businesses, people are like, well, if you're going to consider this an essential business, then how about we get every single person in jail who has been, you know, in these crimes. And I actually, in oh gosh, it was like 8th grade or something, but I did a project on, we had to do a um, argument on whether weed should be legalized or not, and um one of the people brought up that it would actually really help with diminishing crime rates among Black men, and like, you know, I didn't really think that that was an issue until that got brought up. But if you think about how many especially Black men are in prison for small related um drug crimes, it would really be interesting to see the number of,
yeah, especially because like they get searched more, so obviously they'd be arrested more.
yeah, exactly.
All right, we're at like 28 minutes, so should we move on to the last part of the question?
Yeah.
So again, it's what kind of
Unless
policing
anyone has anything
reforms?
else to say.
Does anyone have anything else? No. Okay. The last part is what kind of policing reforms do the readings suggest, but also what changes do you think would be most beneficial to the communities?
I know the reading, like on pages 272 and 273, they were talking about the reforms. One of them mentioned racial diversification of police departments in multiracial cities to enhance the overall reputation of the department. And that kind of, I mean, where did it go? I just had it. It would kind of like help like decrease the idea that like certain races are being stopped more than others, and then also just like represent sorry, the population a little bit more, so it wouldn't seem like, oh, like only white males are like our police department, so
Yeah.
we're gonna be more biased towards white males and not stop them as often.
Yeah, I feel like that could help in a way with like maybe bias, but I feel like overall that's more of like a solution for like the image of police rather than like a structural change.
I guess.
And then like
Because like
another
even if you get rid of the racial aspect, there's also like inherent classism. Like poorer neighborhoods are still going to be searched, and
Right.
like obviously minorities are the ones that live in those neighborhoods.
or I feel like some other like policies like they talked about like doing sensitivity training or like community policing. And then they also talked about like using body cameras, but I feel like the body cameras, I don't know, I feel like they could find a way after those or somehow.
Yeah, I think they've like started implementing that, and it hasn't helped that much because I think that like a lot of white officers still get to keep their jobs and stuff
Yeah.
because they're usually like, well, I felt
Well,
threatened, so how can you
yeah,
negate that?
yeah. I don't think those really body cams have done anything because there have been like literally videos of them like the body cams and the police officer does something wrong and then they get in trouble for like a little
Yeah,
bit on their job and it's
Yeah,
like
they
and
even
like
talked.
there's been, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say they've even talked about how in one of the cameras, the officer was like, "Oh, he was threatening me," and the body cam shows the guy running away. So it's like
Yeah, or
it
like
holds them
I'm
to a little bit of a higher standard, but whether that does anything or not is hard to say.
Yeah, I think I've also heard stories of like sometimes police will like plant drugs in areas and arrest people, and so like they could always turn off their cameras when they plant something and then like turn it back on and be like, look, I found this person with this drug.
Yeah.
exactly.
I actually saw a video somewhere like a week or so ago that someone was filming an arrest and they caught a white officer planting drugs on a black man, and it like went viral. I don't remember where I saw it.
Yeah, I think I saw that one too, probably on Twitter.
Probably. But that just shows that like even with body cam footage and people like recording and like knowing more about their rights to like record during arrests and stuff, like obviously isn't completely, if at all, helping with officers not doing shitty things like that. Like
Yeah,
not making that much of a difference.
Well, and I mean, one of the like, I don't know if they talk about this in the book, but um, police tend to get very aggressive around young black men because they think they're aggressive. And so I don't like, one of the things that I've been thinking about during this like whole time is, I don't know if any of you have watched All American,
yeah, I
but
was just gonna bring that up. Yeah,
when like how Spencer knows to act around the police versus a Beverly Hills. I mean, he's like mixed kid, but how he
yeah,
acts around the police, and like the difference of kind of an like kid from a lower income neighborhood, and he has definitely had experiences with the police. And so I think
mhm.
like there should, I don't know, I mean, it's easy for me to say like they should treat everyone equally because that is never going to happen, but
Yeah, I think there's a huge structural like power difference between police officers and like Black people specifically. Like
mhm.
it's a systemic issue.
And even in that show, like it shows how when a black officer pulls him over and he's still very aggressive towards the Spencer, a young black male, like it's not like, oh, if there's a black officer, like there's not going to be any aggression there.
Yeah, or like racial solidarity or
Yeah,
whatever. Like it's more of a structural power difference than it is really like
A race thing when it comes to
an
police.
individual thing. Yeah.
It's feeling like I just feel like, obviously not all, but like I feel like some police officers, like when you do see things and like stuff goes viral, it's like they feel like they're above the law even though they're supposed to like
Mhm.
be the law. And I feel like that is a big issue that plays into police brutality and just like unfairly treating people.
Yeah, I feel like
Nothing can
some
happen
reforms that like
officer.
yeah, and I feel like if we want like reform, especially because it's such a systemic issue, like the first step would be decriminalizing a lot of things.
mm-hmm.
Because like obviously like they're going to be aggressive when they're arresting somebody no matter what, but if there's less reasons for them to arrest somebody, I feel like then it would go down a little bit.
Yeah, and I feel like other things what changes do you think would be most beneficial to communities? I feel like a small thing, like obviously I would never know how to implement this or make it work, but like, especially in lower income communities or like minority communities, like have like different like things or events where like the community can interact with the police, especially if they're smaller communities, and like get to know the people who like get to know the police officers that like work in your city, because obviously like they're by like cities and like districts, and they have their own like areas they work in, and that way it builds more of a bond, because obviously like poor people and people of color are very untrusting of police, just as police are untrusting of them. So like doing more things in communities with like high.
Is she frozen for y'all too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Rachel, if you can hear us, you're frozen. Okay, but I was gonna say like base like in one of the readings it talks about how the people really don't trust the police because they see everything online and everything, all the bad things that go viral, and so they have a lot of mistrust. There you are.
I do not know what just happened.
Yeah,
they have a lot of mistrust with the police, and so that creates a lot of like aggression and tension between the two. And so I think definitely like having more openness and community events with police would maybe like help them trust, and there be more of a like connection instead of this just aggression.
Yeah, I think because like the law, like in law enforcement is supposed to protect their community, but if there isn't a sense of community there, then it becomes like us versus them. Like we're supposed to like get rid of all the felons there instead of just like seeing it as like, oh, we're helping our community. So I think like your idea would maybe help like by like creating like spaces where they can interact with like law enforcement. So then it becomes more of like a protecting them sort of situation rather than like an aggressive like us versus them situation.
There's actually like a statistic that kind of goes with that in the reading. On page 273, the public overwhelmingly supports each of these reforms regarding civilian review boards responsible for reviewing citizen complaints against officers. 63% of whites, 72% of Hispanics, and 80% of African Americans believe that the creation of oh wait, never mind. I read that wrong. Scratch that, sorry.
No, I think you're right. It's just that what they believe the creation of such a board would improve policing in their city.
Yeah, I honestly read that as bond, like if there was like a bond between that, and then I was like, wait, no one would actually put that in a survey. So, but I mean, that also is another good point, that if there was like a board that could go through and like review all the complaints, and then they could make adjustments within each like department, like to the best that they can.
Yeah, giving the citizens a say, not having it just be the justice system.
Yeah. It gives us more of like makes them feel more safe, like that, knowing like that they're being heard about like their.
Does anyone have any final thoughts?
I think I'm good.
I'm good.
All right, we're at 39 minutes almost exactly, so.
Cool.